Hi everyone, welcome to the ITS Australia Shaping Future Transport discussion series. We've got a great webinar for you today. Obviously, as said previously, it's hard to have a conversation these days that isn't COVID related, but what we want to do is take the opportunity to talk to some subject matter experts that have been working closely in this space on how we can leverage some opportunity out of this disruption. As always, welcome to our ITS Australia members, and if you don't see your logo up here, please get in contact with us because we'd like to have a chat with you. And if you are on the logo screen, please get in touch with us as well because we'd really like to have a chat. As you can see, we're stuck in our little corners of our offices or shared spaces or spare bedrooms, so phone calls and emails are really appreciated. I'm going to hand over to our panelists today to introduce themselves because they'd be better at that than me. So I'll start with Paul. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks, Stacey. My name is Paul Rubitsky. I'm country head of DSpark Australia, which is a data analytics company. We ingest various data sets from different providers, including telco, mobile phone data. So we'll be talking about today how that's relevant and how it can be leveraged during this time and when we get out of this current COVID-19 time.
Thanks, Paul. And Kylie, up to you in sunny Brisbane.
Hi, thanks, Stacey. Kylie Nixon. I'm an associate principal at Arup. I'm a transport engineer and planner involved in lots of public transport and active transport projects. I certainly have a keen passion for walking and cycling, and am a committee member of Ped Bike Trans as well, which is a really great group, and we're all about enabling professionals and those interested in active transport to knowledge share and improve their education and understanding of making and shaping better places for people who walk and ride.
Excellent, thanks, Kylie. You live in a great city for it too. And Adrian, I'm not sure where you currently are, but say hi.
So I'm Adrian Ellison. I'm the Director of Data Science Consulting for DSpark. I have a fairly extensive background in transport, primarily focused on using various types of sensor data, so things like GPS, mobile network data, and other data sets to try and derive and understand how people behave as they move throughout their daily lives.
Excellent, thanks guys. So we've invited you three along to talk about your work that's currently underway, particularly with regards to the data, and Kylie, the work that you've been doing with Arup and your clients on understanding what's currently happening and what to do going forward. So I'm going to hand over to you, and we've identified two big statements. So I'd like to ask you to have a brief comment, each of you in order. So Paul and Kylie and then Adrian, and then we'll have a quick discussion around that afterwards. Any questions you guys have coming through, pop them into the question box and we'll see if we can get to them either during the discussion or at the Q&A at the end. So handing over to you, I'll just move on to the potential for change. So Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. So look, we look at how people move. So what we've noticed here is a lot of questions from our clients, and we work with, if I sort of pretext whom we work with, we work with pretty much every large transport agency across the country. We work a lot in tourism, but as of the last few months, we're not only working with those industries, we're also now working with the health departments around the country who are trying to manage this crisis. So what we noticed, I guess, initially as this all unfolded was there was this immediacy in some of our clients. So the airlines that we work with, you know, that was very dramatic. It kind of changed overnight for those guys as travel shut down. The public transport agencies who run the trains and buses, we saw them not as drastically. I think the demand for those services changed pretty drastically, but their response to that probably not as quickly. They ran the same timetables on the same days for quite a while before they adjusted that. And I guess they have different financial pressure than some of those private airlines or private operators. But we certainly saw different sorts of reactions from these clients to the demand. And the demand is really drastic. You know, I think you've got a slide up ahead, Stacey, but the demand that we're seeing in all modes is down, 90% in cities like Melbourne and Sydney for trips into the CBDs. Brisbane, Adelaide, not far behind with Perth there as well. The roads themselves are, we're down 90% on roads as a mode relative to that February baseline. The average time that people are spending at home is again dramatically different to what it was before this time. So what this really unique event means for public transport, for transport in general, is really quite significant. And I guess what we sort of saw is different responses at different times with different drivers behind them. And now what we're sort of seeing very much is that kind of looking for the recovery and looking to use the sort of data that we work with them on is to try and see how that can start to inform recovery and how quickly is that recovery coming. And so, even in the last few days, in the last week, we're seeing roads as a mode up 10% over the previous week. So there's already signs of recovery, even though, formally some of those restrictions haven't necessarily been lifted, but people seem to feel more comfortable with taking trips on the roads and starting to see that. So very interesting observations from the response, how that differs by different industry and by different operators, private versus government, and how the demand and the people themselves who use these services are responding to that and are behaving and are slowly starting to change. So from our point of view, we've certainly seen a bottoming out, and we're starting to see some initial signs of recovery or return to something that was what we saw before the COVID-19 pandemic hit.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, the numbers have been shocking, and your graphs are highly illustrative of that. Kylie, what's your experience been?
So we certainly have been having, like everybody, it's the topic of choice, isn't it, at the moment? What is that future norm? And what do we use when we're doing a lot of our projects? We have a lot of ongoing projects, and unable to even go and collect traffic counts because they're not going to give us the right messages. But I think certainly we can all agree that what's been happening is clearly transformative. We're going to see some lasting changes. Some of these might be quite significant, and it certainly is not only going to change how we move, but also change how we use our places and our spaces, and that's quite exciting. And I have a colleague, certainly in our UK office, is always saying, never waste a crisis. And so we should certainly all get on board. Certainly when I think about what I like to do, to shape, how our streets and how we move, make better use of what we've already got. I think another thing through, and, obviously we're looking at the data, but also looking at the conversations we're having, and something that certainly has resonated with me of late, getting on really late to catch a webinar from the UK, at certain times, because the conversation, is happening all the time, is that we're no longer experts really in what we're doing anymore. I don't know if anybody can claim you're an expert, because we really don't really know what, I'm going to use the word the road, or, what is the nature of what we're dealing with in terms of how we may continue to move in the future. And certainly we certainly always say this at Arup, and I know, and a lot of us all think the same, that we need to work together. Like, it's not all a transport or traffic engineer working their own silos. We really need to come together, like Paul and Adrian and myself, have those conversations together, because we've all got different skills and we all got different understandings, and I think that's really important. And including that coming together, that's not only across disciplines, but also across all different government agencies, and working strongly with advocacy groups as well, because we all need to work together to get to that common goal, the common vision of what our future norm may be, or what we actually would like to aspire to see. So I guess that's sort of where I've certainly been thinking personally in that space, and there's no one size fits all solution that might get us out of the disruption as we slowly work towards what our future norm would be. But certainly we need to really understand what the problem is. We certainly really need to ask more questions about the data, ask more what people really want, understand the story, and ensure we're focusing on people and I guess what we want in our cities, the place.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. You're not going to get great outcomes unless you get all of the people to the table. I think we use the phrase a lot in that accountability space, nothing for us without us. I think making sure that we have a broad church, and Paul, you touched on that with regards to working with the departments of health, which is, I know that
Yeah,
as well.
and I would also add just to that, the collaboration we've seen in the last 2 months is more than we've ever seen in this industry, whether that's between the state transport authorities, whether that's within transport and health and Premier's office working together, or even councils. You know, we're starting to work with councils who are traditionally interested in their area, but now they're collectively saying, well, actually, it's not just my area because people are staying close to home, so therefore tell me about my neighbouring councils, and they're sort of collaborating and joining. So there's certainly, I think the theme of collaboration is one that we've seen very strongly in the last couple of months.
Yeah, I've been talking to some data scientists at some universities, one particular at UTS, and she said she's seeing data that she's never seen before, didn't even know it existed. So that's amazing. So on that, Adrian, as the resident data scientist, what's your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, so it's been very interesting to watch the data as it comes in and seeing how people's behavior is changing on a day-by-day basis. But I think it also sort of brings it to light the fact that for decades, actually, we've been collecting data sets on how people behave and what trips they make and where they go and all these types of things that we use as input into a lot of our transport models, a lot of our decision making. And you know, some of the standard things that we used to do in the past, looking at year-on-year changes, for example, looking at what are the impacts of a particular type of new development, for instance, all these types of things that we used to use all these existing data sets and assumptions about how people behave. I'm not actually sure we'll ever go back to be able to use that in the same way, because we don't necessarily know that those assumptions will still hold entirely. Once all this is said and done. I mean, certainly when we've looked at other disruptions which are much smaller in scale, both in terms of the time frame and the spatial locations that they impact, we've seen that there are permanent changes that people make as a consequence. And so it would be very surprising to me if we don't see the same thing here. And then the question is, if that's the case, how do we even start to make some of these decisions about how we implement new services? Because we're using data, we can use the data that we've collected in the past month or two, but there's no guarantee that that's what we're going to see next month or in 2 months' time. And there's obviously going to be some relationship with where people work and where they live and all the usual things that we look at. But clearly what we've seen, you can see it on the charts, where people have reduced the number of trips they make, but they've reduced the distance that they're traveling more so. And what that suggests is that people are finding new places to go and new things to do, which maybe they hadn't explored previously. And I don't think we will see things go back to normal. And so the question is, if we're doing all our planning on the basis of returning to some type of baseline that we saw in the past, I don't know that we'll ever see that to the same degree. So I think it's going to be quite interesting how we adapt our analytical methods and our decision making to account for the fact that we're dealing with a very large number of unknown variables here, which are continuously changing. So it'll be interesting to see how people adapt on that basis.
Unmute myself.
I was going to say.
Yeah, just quick question with regards to comparing like to like and a new benchmark. You've got comparisons here to January, which has been pointed out was a holiday period. So what are you seeing? Obviously, there's still a massive reduction in patronage and movement, but as compared to 2019, the same time from 2020.
We're seeing significant reductions from 2019, 2018, all the previous years that we look at. There's a big difference in what we're seeing at the moment. But yeah, as Paul said, the differences are different for different locations. So the CBD, we've seen a very big reduction. just like you can see in the top right chart there with the flights. But if you look at some mainly residential areas, the reduction in the number of trips hasn't been that large. What's happened is people are just staying closer to home. But I think my point about looking at year-on-year changes is when we compare that year-on-year, that's fair enough to do that now because we're comparing what's happening under the current situation to what's happened last year under sort of normal conditions at the same time of year. But when we come to next year, if we try and do a year-on-year comparison to this year, obviously that's going to be a problem because the current circumstances aren't typical. But even if we said, okay, well, let's skip 2020 and we'll go compare 2021 to 2019, which is the last typical year, I'm not convinced you'll see you'll see differences there that are a consequence of the behavioural change that has happened as a consequence of the disruptions this year. And so the question is whether or not it's then valid to compare to 2019 in terms of trying to predict, particularly for something like forecasting, for example, we're trying to predict how people will move in 2030, 2040, which is quite common. How can we use the history now? We have to make certain assumptions, or at least we have to look at what differences we see in the behavior that people are actually exhibiting to account for the fact that the data that we've collected over years or decades even in some cases has to have some adjustments made to account for that.
It really does.
A simple one would be, for instance, if we've made assumptions about on average people making a certain number of trips per week to work, for instance, if now people are working from home more often because they know it's possible and they now have the tools available to do that, then we have to account for that when we look at the change in behavior that we see.
Thanks, Adrian. Kylie, you mentioned that this was exciting. Does this indicate opportunity? Obviously, you work a lot with models and to understand how to implement the planning decisions that you make advisory on. What are your thoughts about adapting some of these?
Well, certainly I don't personally do transport models myself, but certainly the excitement I was sort of feeling that certainly is a great time to go out and test new measures, testing, putting infrastructure out there, in that temporary format, that, the good old quicker, lighter, value for money, cost effective approach rather than saying cheaper. But, test it and find out, how it works, get some good evidence, some more data from it, as Adrian said, and actually asking the community, we're trying to understand your change of behaviour. We're looking at, different measures, and it's not all infrastructure, social, technological means to support this travel behaviour change and creating these new places and gathering that evidence, and this is something that might become a firm, outcome solution that might change a space. And that also might help with that future modelling. So you've got some real data of, understanding what sticks. There's a lot of evidence from, we know with travel behaviour change from major events like the Olympics and the like, which is, a lot of planning, a lot of coming together for a very short period of time. And, and with London 2012 in particular, there was some real strong travel behaviour change measures that were put in place because we needed to try and move the people around the city, to ensure that those coming to Stratford City could use, the London Underground or some of the other forms of transport to get there. And what I understand that some of the positive of that travel behaviour change, that there was, a lot of that stuck with people. I think something like 15 to 20% of people actually kept those same behaviours that they had as a result of that change. So there's a little bit of understanding, I think, that we still need to have with, looking at opportunities, testing, changes to our streets, our roads, our places, and that might actually help understanding what the new model might be and what we might see, in the future for, estimating what what might be. Certainly a lot of scenario planning and testing.
Thanks, Kylie. That really neatly takes us to the next big topic, which is sort of rethinking business as usual. So how do we embed the best outcomes, and how do we deliver this behavioural change in a way that might stick and might be good for all of us? Paul, I'll hit you up for that one.
Sure. I think there's an important, like the example Kylie just gave on the London Olympics is a good one, because we can look at events like that, and we've looked, say, in the past at something like Hoddle Street in Melbourne that was shut down for a period of time, when almost something is introduced as a change, somewhat controlled, and then reopened, and then things go back to somewhat norm. But even in that case, that thing was shut down for a couple of weeks, but it didn't go back to norm. People found different ways of commuting, different routes. And I think people always do that. So whether it's a big event like the Olympics, or whether it's a shutdown of a road like that, or even, you know, the Harbour Bridge closes for a day because there's something there and people just find new ways. I think in the additional thing here is it's not just an event or a disruption like that. It's people's lives are changing. So your openness, you know, we're as a company talking about it, or do you go back to a different work from home model subsequent to this? Whilst there's still a concept of a workplace and a home place, but do you change your routine? Do you change the way that your kids get dropped off at school, or the way you do exercise, or when you do those things, when you eat dinner? I mean, personally, we're eating dinner much sooner now than we ever used to. So does that remain? So I think in general, this is a really exciting for people with data and people that work on these projects and work in this industry. It's one of those really rare moments where it's not only the infrastructure that's potentially going to be affected or changed, but your life in general, and the way that we as human beings behave. So seeing that sort of smashed together, forced in a really quick way, will be really fascinating. So I can sort of see people talking about this theme of, okay, well, let's talk about recovery. How is it recovering? How quickly? When does it get to whatever is the new norm? But there'll be a lot of analysis, a lot of deep dives on, well, what does that look like? What changed? What's new? What's different? And some of that will come from your traditional surveys that you'll need to ask people about how they feel and how they think about their life and their commuting through that life. But others will have to be looking at new data, new information, new ways of thinking about these things and solving these problems, and even, you know, the practical timetable on a train or a bus network that today accommodates for peak. Is that right? Like, do we need to rethink that a little bit in the way that you come out of this and you rethink some of those new data inputs into some of those traditional, infrastructure models and timetables? So for me, it's really exciting in that I don't know if I like the terms business as usual or baseline, because it's almost too big to kind of use those sort of words. I don't know what the right words are, but for us, it's exciting when people start to then really think innovatively around what's the new thing and why did it happen, and why are people doing this now in the way they're doing versus what it was before COVID-19. So it's really quite a special time in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think I was nodding along with Kylie with quite a lot of that. As ITS Australia, we've just been drafting a letter to government, sort of indicating this is a once in a lifetime shock, which also presents a once in a lifetime opportunity. So yeah, I'm with you that business as usual is a very banal way of thinking about this. So Kylie, you were nodding. What were your thoughts?
I was nodding because I was laughing at the. I actually wrote it down because I think it's a great point. We ate dinner at a different time. I thought, oh yes, that's so true. Yeah, so much has changed. So it's that reprioritization, isn't it, about what's important, and recognizing that, yeah, the old business models aren't necessarily the right business models, as Adrian was saying, because we can't necessarily look back to the year before. Certainly the benefits that we want to deliver for people are still there, and it's shifting, I think, and potentially re-looking at those so that we actually are achieving the benefits and that focus for the why for whatever we're doing. So I think that's that's also quite exciting. And for me, it's always, and I think Paul said it, you know, it's bringing it back to people, bringing it back to us, make sure we're asking those questions and not just taking data at face value, but yeah, digging right into the data so we are asking the right questions to get the outcomes.
Adrian, as the owner and the manipulator of the data, how does this change for you going forward?
Well, I think Paul's point on timing changes, I think, is actually quite interesting, because that's one of the big levers of change, that, or behavior change, that we've historically tried to encourage people to do, right? Can we spread the peaks out a bit? And it's been quite interesting looking at our real-time data over the past 2 days even, to see that those people that are going to work, they're going to work a bit later, and they're spending a bit less time there and going home earlier. And so that traditional sort of morning peak, afternoon peak is actually spread out a bit more than we've seen in the past. But I think more to the point, I think it's just that if people are going to different places at different times, and we want to provision services to allow people to travel there by public transport, walking, cycling, all these things that we're trying to encourage, as opposed to what people have been doing recently, which is to travel by car instead. That works when the number of trips is substantially reduced. But if the trip volume eventually comes back up again, we're going to start having issues where the infrastructure and the services that we've provided and designed aren't accommodating where people actually want to go anymore. And so the data that we've seen suggests that we will need to take advantage of these opportunities, but also think quite carefully about the fact that there's a sort of feedback loop between what trips people are making and the services that we provide, right? So if we know from looking at the data that there are more people going to a certain location, and we provide services to account for that, then the question is, what else can we do to ensure that they're traveling there using public transport, by walking, by cycling, rather than reverting to the car, which is the simplest option for most people. And I think we really want to take advantage of that, because it's rare that we can switch people out of their cars and into public transport. Usually when we've done analysis on the past in terms of changes to public transport infrastructure, normally we're switching people from the train to the bus, or the bus to the train, or people who were walking and now taking the bus. Certainly that's what we saw when Opal was implemented, for example. A lot of the increase in the volume was actually from people that previously would have walked. And so we have this sort of tension in that we're actually trying to solve a problem that has multiple objectives, and the data has to be flexible enough to be able to pull out all the different variables, rather than being able to look at one specific view. And I think that's one of the challenges is organizationally, just in terms of how the industry has been set up. We've tended to look at things in quite a siloed approach, and I don't think that's going to work if we want to take advantage of these differences and these opportunities to change how we move around, but also how we provision those services.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. There's been some discussion around the fact that we've spent months enforcing physical distancing, and people are getting very much more comfortable with that now. If things go, when they open up, the expectation is that people will just jump in their cars and not go back to public transport. So looking at mechanisms to enable that. Sorry, Kylie, I interrupted you. What were you?
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point, and it certainly has been. I feel that it's been a key topic of discussion on many of the webinars or sessions that I've been joining of late, and particularly from a public transport point of view, because I dare say, certainly there's going to be a higher level of nervousness from many of the customers that our transport networks, public transport networks already have today, or the potential customers that they were hoping to have about resuming their travel by public transport. And it certainly does need a lot of considered thought about about these customers, public transport customers, and asking them and working with the transport authorities to ensure that we can, get that level of demand back up. And will it be the same immediately? More than likely not, but I think that's where we can leverage on this increase walking and cycling as well, and recognizing that with more people working from home and going to different places, as Paul said and you said as well, Adrian, that there is that opportunity for people who really do need to use a PT to to either get to a place of work or a service or that there should be some capacity on that. Certainly heard in Europe, that public transport capacity or demand on certain modes, it's down by 95%, and that's quite a significant drop. I certainly don't know the number exactly for Brisbane, but I certainly understand it's high because I see buses going past my street who don't have many people on them. So I think that's certainly an important place that we need to certainly talk about and ensure that we aren't going back to private cars, and and acknowledging that travel behaviour change, generally thinking about it's like a nudge. Well, this has certainly been a stick. It's a massive stick. So, and how quick we come out of that, this change, I think that's something worth discussing. And if we take the opportunity to have maybe a slow bump out, if we think of it from a gains perspective, we've got a chance to put in more measures or change policy, do that tactical urbanism to actually hopefully not see that massive jump back into private cars for travel. Because I must say it's been wonderful to have less traffic on the local road near me. I've certainly ridden my bike up and down the road that I would never have done before.
Yeah, same here. I feel a lot safer out on the roads than I ever have. So to that, David Henchett from ITLS has asked that question specifically with regards to reducing the impact of people getting into their cars. Is the data available to work with employers to show that there isn't necessarily the productivity loss that they might anticipate, that they can incentivize working from home or changing operating hours for their staff? Is that did they spark data of movement and analysis for people to get a better understanding of what value they can have if they don't have to have all of their staff in the office at 9 o'clock?
Yeah, so most of the data we look at, Stacey, is more focused on the movement of people, not necessarily what they're doing when they're somewhere. So not necessarily to inform when you're at home what you're actually doing there, as opposed to where you're spending time, how you're getting between point A and point B. So that's certainly where we're up to today. So I think, but again, if you kind of think about if you do change that general behaviour on a Monday to Friday, whereby you are encouraging people to spend less time in cars or on trains and public transport, there is a question around, well, what are people substituting that time with? So where we can help is potentially looking at what are all those trips that people are making and where are they going and where are they spending time as opposed to what they're necessarily doing there. So you could convert some of that new time that's available if organizations do move towards a more work from home centric model, what people are doing within their day, within their 24-hour cycle of trips and movement and based on land use, you can certainly derive quite a lot of information around people's behavior. So that's probably one way to think about that. Adrian, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so I think what we can see is we can see what people are doing in terms of where they're moving between. Are they spending time at home? And I think one of the concerns always for employers in the past has always been, well, they say they're working from home. Are they really working from home? And I think to some degree we can use the data to show that actually, I mean, on average, people are spending a lot more time at home now than they have in the past. But the reality is that, and you probably have noticed anecdotally, is if you go out at 11 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, times when traditionally people would have been at work, you are still seeing plenty of people walking around, going to the shops at those times. But I think ultimately the employers can measure productivity on their own. They should have that data. But what we can show is that it doesn't really matter whether somebody pops out to the shops at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if they're then working a bit later in the evening. And that's something that's a bit harder to handle when somebody has to come into work at a certain time and leave work at a certain time in order to get home. And so the times that people choose to travel, choose to perform activities is now much more spread throughout the day. And I don't think that necessarily means that people are less productive. It just means that people are using the time to do things in a way that's more efficient. I mean, after all, if you can get to somewhere at a time when it takes you 20 minutes to get there, rather than when it takes you an hour and a half to get there, that's going to save you a significant amount of time that you could spend on sort of productive uses. But I think, and David would be familiar with this, is this concept of, we've traditionally tried to measure the value of projects by using travel time savings. And the premise there has always been that the amount of time that you don't travel, you're doing something productive with that time instead. So if you reduce congestion, we're saying that every minute that you're saving, you're instead doing something productive with that time. And I think the mobility data has the potential to show whether or not people actually do that, or whether they're using their travel time savings to do additional trips, which has always been the question, right? Is does reducing congestion generate more trips, or does it simply rearrange what people are doing?
I think it changes the benchmarks that we're looking at as well. Like what does an effective use of the network look like? There's some comments up saying people have never worked harder and at all hours. I was in a meeting just before this, and somebody commented that now that they're permanently set up at home, they're working all time zones as well. Kylie, you touched on that as well. Like now that you've like getting into webinars at other time zones that you might previously have given a miss.
Yeah, because I'm not doing my my ride or my walk to the office. So yes, there's especially if you've got a webinar from the Americas up at 3 a.m. or something like that. Yeah, definitely. I certainly found my own. I mean, I've always worked at very odd times of the day because those who know me, I certainly do like to talk, you know, and have a chat in the office. So I do find that if I've been in a lot of meetings during the day, which hasn't changed, you know, catching up on what you do need to deliver, but also, you know, being at home more, you know, I've got kids, there's those interruptions, but also ensuring I'm spending a little bit more time with them. And, you know, I come into my office, there's always laughter. You're not at work, mum. So yeah, so I find I do work at different times of the day differently, but I think I've always engaged quite a lot across our organisation, but I do find I am engaging a little bit more, you know, with what's happening, because I think the conversation is really important, and it certainly is really key to ensure we're learning off of each other, and you know, and different cities, different places, you know, are reacting and all doing different things, and so we can certainly learn from it.
Yeah, another comment was with regards to traffic finding its own equilibrium, and I think that's the case as well of people's workplace behaviours and how they work and how they learn. We've always known that people learn differently. People obviously have always worked differently, but in the tight constraints of a formal business operation. I'm very familiar with Arup, and you know, there's always an enablement of flexible working, but in some organisations and in government as well, there's you can, but should you? Like, there is still a pejorative attached to some very flexible work arrangements sometimes. This has just put an end to all of that, hopefully, like blasted it out of the water. I saw you nodding there, Paul.
Yeah, I very much, that is a bit of that kind of taboo, right? Like you can do it, but does it reflect on me in some way or another? And so I think, I mean, I'm just thinking as well that there's this sort of thought in my mind as we're talking, that what is probably going to happen, and it's a shame, is that nothing will actually change in the next few months, if assuming we get this thing under control and we do go back to baseline, and a lot of these transport authorities will just restart things as they were, both in terms of their workforce, timetables, pricing, and all of the other elements that they control. And I fear a little bit that that's what will happen. And I guess then, what role do we have to play as an industry to kind of influence that? You mentioned, Stacey, kind of a letter or an ask. It's really important for us to kind of push for that, such that, there is some noise around bringing forward and activating certain infrastructure projects, investing and helping to restart the economy with jobs and input of funding into that. But I think from a how does this whole system operate, for things like mobility as a service, this is a great opportunity to accelerate that and bring that forward and actually, put some of these trials into places where maybe now they will be better suited based on what people did during this time and how they changed and how they will be behaving differently. And so what I worry about a bit is that we're not actually using this, and we don't use this as an opportunity, and we just quickly want to get back to what we know and are familiar with, and then maybe look at the learnings, as opposed to right now, working towards a different restart with a different baseline of some sorts. And I guess that is important for us to play a role in somehow influencing that. Otherwise, it's just really easy to go back to that stuff that we are all familiar with and that routine. And I think that would be a shame if we kind of did that. So it's just sort of something on my mind as we're talking and exploring some of these topics.
Yeah, it would be an appalling loss, beyond the loss we've already experienced if we did just reset and not make the most of the potential to do something differently. And to that end, we're in discussions with a few different people on some iMove research projects. So if anybody's on the line that has interest in that, certainly get in contact, because the more participants we have in framing what a research project might look like, to better understand whether it's a behavioural insights survey, analysing some data to understand we had discussions with people from transport agencies, and with Howard Collins last week on what percentage of reduction of transport in the peak might look like to really give long-term benefits for the transport agencies from a safety and utility perspective. So we've got a few minutes left. I'll wrap up some of the questions and see if I can get you guys to answer them later. One of them was with regards to, I think, a particular area of interest for you, Kylie, and we talked about this a while ago on what other people are doing with regards to pop-up, urban tacticalism with regards to repurposing streets for bike lanes and more pedestrian and parkways. So do you see opportunities to take that to some councils and governments and say, now's your chance?
Yeah, definitely. I'll be there with my hands up. I've got a few ideas myself, but yes, certainly. I think we've seen some. There's certainly some good examples. There's been examples across the water in New Zealand where they certainly looked at their streets, and Milan has certainly been the hot topic of discussion. With I think is it 35 kilometres. It's a significant proportion of their streets that they've been changing or transforming as a result of the need to address social distancing, but also to address, the fact that in some cities it's about not having enough access to, parks and places that they can go to. So the streets are actually, and we know streets are certainly a place. We had a really great discussion about this the other night with Queensland Walks as well, and one of the listeners on the line certainly flagged that there are a lot of streets where, the opportunity is already there, and it's almost about formalising it. Children are already playing in the streets, so and everybody who knows who goes through that street, know that they need to be low speed. So, looking at those opportunities as well and formalising it. So certainly feel that there are certainly opportunities there, and with whatever pop-up or temporary measure, we need to get the data, get some evidence and see how it's working, because if it isn't working, we can always pull it out. I think that's something that everybody needs to recognise with that.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. That was a positive note to wrap up on. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I encourage people on the line to check out the websites of Arup and DSpark. Up there, Arup's easy. It's just arup.com, and you can find out all the projects that they've been working on. Arup, I'll mention for you, Kylie, they've also been publishing some work they've been doing on data modelling. It's quite beautiful as well as useful and interesting. Paul and Adrian, do you have anything in particular with regards to information that you might direct our audience to?
No, look, we appreciate the time and being part of the webinar. It's great to be in this conversation and great to shine a light on this sort of data that's now available in the market, real time and non-real time. So we're excited to hear from some of the panelists and continue making an impact, really, hopefully through this event and helping be part of the solution, because we are genuinely excited about this and we've been busier in the last couple of months than we ever have been since we started. So hopefully that continues. So thanks very much for letting us be a part of it today.
Thanks, and a lot of people feel the same. And we'll definitely be in contact. We're working on, I think I mentioned before, the program for Mobility 2020, which will of course be online. So we'll be in touch with you guys with regards to sharing any updates on that. And for webinar next week, we're having a slightly different structure. We're going to have Brad Singleton from the Singularity University and Dr. Michael Milford from QUT. They're going to be having a debate on CAV, and they've each got interesting views on the difference between the need for LiDAR and cameras and other utility to make and technologies to make CAVs work. So looking forward to that one. So if you could go to itsaustralia.com.au and you can register for that. So thanks everyone, and I'll see if I can get to some of these questions with the guys and get them up on our website. So
thank you.
Thanks.
Safe everyone. Bye.
Thank you.